Good evening. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements. The first one is there is construction going on in the town center area, and they broke one of the water lines today. So if you go in the restroom and the water looks really suspect, it's been really brown, so it's fine for flushing toilets, but it's probably not good to drink. But the concession stand is open if you need water or anything else. The concession stand is open. And the second announcement I was asked to make for the League of Women Voters and the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. They are sponsoring a meet and greet for all local candidates next Thursday, October 24th from 6:30 to 8:30 at the Kempsville Rec Center. So they extend an invitation to any of you who would like to come out next Thursday, the 24th, at 6:30 at the Kempsville Rec Center. You're welcome. And I also I hope everyone picked up a program on your way in. And I wanted to draw your attention to, I included, this is the first time I've done this, but I included the 9 questions that will be asked by the panel in the program, so you can follow along, or you can go back and reference them later if there's something you want to look up or that kind of thing. I thought it might be helpful to you. So the first group of questions will be asked by our panel, and our 3 panelists are James Lang, who is an attorney with Pender and Coward, and Benjamin Hone, who is the program director for the Virginia Interfaith Council for Public Policy. Do I have it right? the Virginia Interfaith Council for Public Policy. And our third panelist is Jim Deppie, who's a retired Navy officer and currently works with the Surfrider Foundation on a lot of issues to keep our oceans clean. So we're happy to have our panelists with us tonight. And one other logistic, we will start the first question with Nancy Guy and go down the table, but then with each subsequent question, we'll start with the next person in the line. So no one is always the first to answer, and no one is always the last to answer. We do have a timer, Emil Baraki, the most important person in the room. And he'll put up a card to kind of let you know where you are on your time limit. We have a minute and a half for the first question, and then a minute for each of the other panel questions, and then a minute and a half for your closing statement at the end. So after we do the panel questions, we will be taking questions from the audience. You should have gotten a note card on your way in. If you have a question that you would like to ask the panel that's not a part of the questions that are prepared ahead for the panel, then please write it on your note card and hold your hand up, and Jody and Vince will come around and pick it up from you. And if you didn't get a note card or you need an additional one, hold up your hand and they will bring you a note card, and we will ask as many of the audience questions as possible after we complete the panel questions. So I think that's all the logistical information, and I believe we're ready to go. So the first question will be asked by James Lang, and we will start with Nancy Guy.
Good evening. Good evening. Is this on? Terrific. Good. I'm Jim Lang. I'm a waterfront property law attorney with the Pender & Coward Law Firm just up the street. Good evening. First question is, offshore wind development has been recognized by many as an exceptional economic opportunity for Hampton Roads. Do you support and would you provide funding for a Virginia Office of Offshore Wind within DMME and additional funding to advance the offshore wind industry? Please answer.
Short answer is yes. Offshore wind is surprisingly and somewhat sadly, a completely mature industry that has developed totally outside the United States of America. It offers an exceptional opportunity for us here in Hampton Roads because we have the workforce, we have the port facilities without an overhead height restriction to export turbines to become the center of offshore wind for the East Coast. The only thing missing was an actual investment by our own utility companies in having a closed-to-form farm. That's now been resolved. Dominion announced in September, right after the governor announced his new goals for carbon emissions reductions, that they are going to start developing the wind farm that is located 47 miles off the coast that they hold, starting in 2020 and to be operational in 2026. And it should provide power for 650,000 homes. But even more excitingly for Hampton Roads, could create as many as 12,000 jobs. So we need to make sure that those things happen. And the best way to make sure those things happen is to have somebody around to keep an eye on Dominion and keep their feet to the fire to make it happen.
Thank you. Chris Stolle.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for hosting this. I think this is my 6th Lynnhaven River now.
Probably. It's
event.
my 11th.
Your 11th. Wow. So this is always a fantastic forum, and I want to thank all of you all for being out here today. Certainly I support offshore wind. I think the moves that Dominion has made to commit to 2,600 megawatts, that's more than a nuclear plant can put out, so that will be an incredible asset for not only Virginia, but for Hampton Roads in particular. Truly a great opportunity for job creation here as well. One of the big issues associated with that is the actual transportation of the wind turbines and the blades that go along with that. There are certain rules that require that transportation within the United States has to be done by U.S. flagged ships. So the ability for us to take and create a ship that can transport that would also mean that Hampton Roads would be the hub for developing wind, not only here, but also all up and down the East Coast. So I think that this is a huge opportunity for us. Second part of the question is about an office within a DMME. From my perspective, 15 seconds, darn. There's an awful lot to be done in DEQ. The skill sets that we need for the 21st century, they do not have. And so we need to take a look at totally revamping DEQ and making sure that we include the necessary skill sets for coastal flooding as well.
Thank you. Gayle Johnson.
I want to also thank Lynnhaven River Now for doing this forum and all of you for being here tonight. And I'll just add a couple of things, because it's true everything that Nancy said, that this is an amazing opportunity and this will create all the electricity that we need. The coastal continental shelf of the United States, starting from North Carolina up to Maine, and then also in the Great Lakes region, there is enough potential for wind power to to provide more than twice the electricity that we are using now in the entire nation. So that means we get started on this wind farm, we get started manufacturing the wind turbine parts, because right now they all have to be imported. And the base of the wind turbine is as tall as the hotel right here. So it needs to go in a place where you have the deep channel for the big ships and a place where there are no bridges. And that's us, Hampton Roads. We have the opportunity to be not only to do this 220 wind turbine farm, the largest one so far committed, but we also have the opportunity to be the manufacturing and distribution hub all up and down the East Coast and into the Great Lakes. 15 seconds. What else do I always say? One important thing about the Dominion's farm is that this 220 wind turbines is going to reduce our carbon emissions by 55% by 2030. So that's a very important component of this.
Thank you. Jason Miyares.
It's Jason Miyares. Great to be here. It is awesome as well to be in a theater. I was a thespian in high school. So I did a lot of plays, and it's just really neat to be back on a stage for the first time since I was 18. So it's great to be here. As far as I absolutely support this, I think it's a remarkable statement of what excites me about the future is just the impact of how technology is going to fundamentally change how we live our lives. And the idea that we can have the technology now to create an offshore wind farm that produces as much energy as a nuclear plant, and they could power close to 500,000 homes, yet it's clean energy, I think is just what makes, I think, the future so incredibly exciting. So I think that is, I think, the wave of the future. We know that there is a huge amount of demand for this technology, number one. Number two, we know we're at a cross-section in Hampton Roads where we have the perfect geographic location. I think it is something offshore we could do that our Navy and our military supports, which is fantastic as well. It obviously creates thousands of new jobs in this area in a growing, savvy field. So I think offshore, and I'm delighted to see that Dominion has an interest and is going to be making this investment. And I think that is exactly the type of smart thinking we have to need from our elected leaders and those in the private sector as well, and I absolutely support it.
Alex Askew.
Good evening. My name is Alex Askew. I'm running for the 85th District of the Virginia House of Delegates. I want to thank Lynnhaven River Now for having us and having this wonderful forum where we can discuss these very important issues to our region. But to answer the question, I would say absolutely yes to looking into solar wind energy. You know, as we all know, it's a lot cleaner alternative than coal. It's a lot safer than nuclear power. And I also believe that it's cheaper and sometimes a safer alternative. You know, it also creates jobs. As many of the panel previously discussed, we have the prime opportunity to make this another industry where we could develop, build. So that's a whole another generation of skilled workers that can look to expand this industry across the nation. As I believe Ms. Johnson said, as we've deepened and widened our ports, we have the ships big enough to take them from Florida to the Northeast. So to answer the question, I absolutely believe in creating to invest in the offshore wind industry.
Thank you. Our second question will be asked by Benjamin Hone, and we'll start with Stolle.
Thanks, Karen. As Karen said, I'm Benjamin Hoyne with the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, Policy Director there. I look forward to working with you all in Richmond in January. The question is, joining with 9 other East Coast states in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, known as RGGI, offers Virginia the opportunity to not only take steps towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also bring significant funds into the state to put toward priorities like assisting localities with coastal flooding. Do you support Virginia joining RGGI? If not, what are your objections?
We hear a lot today about social justice. RGGI is
You
the...
may want to bring the mic a little.
Okay.
Thank you.
We hear a lot today about social justice. RGGI is the antithesis of social justice. It is a regressive tax on the poor. You'll hear a number of people say, oh, gee, rates go down. Rates do not go down under RGGI. Average bills go down under RGGI. And there's a big difference between rates and average bills. If you are wealthy enough to take and invest in energy improvements in your home, then you're going to get savings under RGGI. If you don't own your home and you if you rent and you pay your own power bill, your landlord has no incentive whatsoever to take and make those energy efficient changes to your home. That means that those folks, lower income folks, bear the burden of RGGI and the fact of actually lowering the cost when the rates go up. This is a tax on the poor, and if we want to take and raise money for coastal adaptation and other efforts, we need to find another way to do it.
Gayle Johnson.
I'm Gayle Johnson in District 82. We must join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it is not a regressive tax. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative improves GDP in the states that have joined it by 3%. Now, there's some misinformation going around that the bills are going to raise. And that's based on some data from, or a statement by the SCC, but there's no data behind that. They don't say where that figure came from. And even if the rates raise, part of my plan is to give tax incentives for the lower income people to get solar panels, to do the energy retrofits. I had a company called Eco Builders of Virginia, and we went in and did energy efficiency retrofits of existing homes. That is what we did. And we made people more comfortable than they'd ever been in their home, and it cost $2,000. The Department of Energy was paying for 25% of that. Our state of Virginia, through DAMME, can do the same thing now.
Thank you. Jason Miyares.
I think my sentiment's probably more where Delegate Stolle is on this, mainly because I want to go where the numbers lead. And the studies that have been done of RGGI is it absolutely impacts those that are on fixed income. And listen, it's difficult. Listen, I was a situation when I was in high school, I remember this distinctly. My father left home. And so I was living with a mother on a fixed income. And even when gas prices went up, I remember one time struggling where we'd even go on vacation because it would affect our driving distance for her monthly budget. So I'm acutely aware of those because of my own personal experience of what happens when energy costs go up. It absolutely impacts what you spend on your children's education, on your family's well-being. And so for me right now, when the data is showing that this absolutely affects those on fixed income, I just don't think it's something that those families can afford.
Alex Askew.
Just last year, as I was Chief of Staff in the General Assembly for Delegate Jay Jones, we worked on passing RGGI. I was disappointed to see it fail. I was disappointed to see it gutted and then ultimately failed. I think it is very important to work regionally on this issue. I think if just a few states are working on this and not all of them, we are working from behind and we're not going to make any efforts. I know a lot of folks look at this economically, but I think it's more than economically. I think it's the future of our coast and our coastal economy.
Thank you. Our third question. Oh, I'm sorry, Nancy. I'm
cycle
sorry.
back
I'm
around.
sorry.
Don't forget me.
Thanks for speaking up.
My support for joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is one of the major differences between me and my opponent. Now, tonight he talked about how he's worried about social justice, but when he spoke on the floor of the House in support of the bill that would prohibit Virginia from joining RGGI, he said, and I quote, and I wrote this down because I don't like misquoting people like I've been misquoted lately, quote, if all 8.5 million Virginians stopped emitting carbon tomorrow, it would have zero statistical impact. So the reason he opposes it is because he doesn't think it's important and he doesn't think it works. I disagree. I think it's important and I think it works. And there are studies that show that it does. The 9 states that have participated in it for the last 10 years have had almost a 50% decrease in carbon emissions. The Clean Air Task Force study of those 10 states show that they have saved thousands of lives and saved $5.7 billion in public health costs. So it is a program that works, and it's a program we should participate in.
Thank you, and I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's okay.
Our third question will be asked by Jim Deppie, and we'll start with Gayle Johnson.
The effects of climate change are very apparent in recurrent flooding in Virginia Beach and elsewhere in Hampton Roads. Given what we are learning about trees and their ability to prevent flooding, not to mention their ability to take in toxic carbon dioxide from the air, would you be willing to support legislation that would give localities the authority to increase tree preservation requirements? And are you willing to sponsor that legislation?
Absolutely. Not only would I want to sponsor legislation that would give us an exemption from the Dillon rule in order to preserve our trees, I would like to sponsor legislation that will just get rid of the Dillon Rule. It's outdated. It was first adopted in 1896. It allows the state government to meddle in local jurisdictions on small things that they never should have any say in whatsoever. It wastes a lot of time in the General Assembly. It's got to go. First thing, though, if we only have to do an exemption to save our trees, one mature tree can absorb 330 pounds of carbon. A live oak absorbs more than that. A mature live oak, like we have many, 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 absorbs even more. It breaks my heart, and I know I've talked to a lot of people. Every time a new construction starts, and the first thing they do is come in and cut the trees. Or there was one a block away from me, they saved the trees, and then one day they came in and took them. And though we're talking about trunks like this. That will help carbon emissions, it will hold soil stability, and it's a good example of why we need to get rid of the Dillon Rule altogether.
Jason Miyares.
I guess the third question is always asked any time there's legislation in front of me, if somebody asks me to carry, is number one, what is the problem we're trying to solve? 2, does the legislation solve the problem? And 3, what's the law of unintended consequences? I think that's always the last question that rarely is asked of government. Now, as far as this, obviously I want more trees planted. I obviously not only just aesthetically, and I hate the fact that you see neighborhoods that are then torn down. It breaks my heart. I think it's part of the character of who we are in Virginia is the fact that we're largely a green state. I guess my question on this would be, if someone was to come with me on this, is what is the problem we're trying to solve? Is the problem that localities are prohibiting or making it next to impossible to do tree preservation? Okay, well then let's discuss. That's the problem. What's the legislation in front of me? Because I often say I don't vote on ideas, I vote on legislation. What is before me? And if that is a problem and could solve the problem, then absolutely I'd be open to that discussion. And then of course I'd ask, what would be the unintended consequences here? That would be the question I'd ask as well.
Alex Askew.
Yes, and I'm not trying to make light of this, but I don't believe people really know the importance of trees they have in our environment. They help. They're sort of the lifeblood and the lungs of our not economy necessarily, but our oxygen and what we breathe. Trees capture rainwater. They help with runoff, clean runoff before it goes into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So absolutely, I would be looking and would look to carry that bill and support that bill fully.
Nancy Guy.
This bill was introduced last session, House Bill 2333, which would have allowed localities to require developers to plant more trees than are required under Virginia's canopy law. That bill went to the Committee on Cities, Counties, and Towns, of which my opponent is a part, and it died there. I like trees. Yes, I will both vote for and be willing to sponsor a bill which will allow localities to require developers within their confines to plant more trees than are required under Virginia's canopy law.
Thank you. Chris Stolle.
Thank you. Yes, I sit on County, Cities, and Towns, and this bill actually came before the subcommittee that I chair. Everybody on that subcommittee voted against that. All Democrats except for one voted against the bill. The bill had a number of significant problems associated with it. It wasn't about tree preservation. The bill was about canopy, tree canopy, and whether the size of the canopy at 10 years and 20 years. So what the issue was is that the legislation that came forward allowed the change in the tree canopy. So we talk about affordable housing. If you change the amount of canopy that those trees have over a certain time period, it means that you have to plant larger, more expensive trees. And so this bill that we did kill in that, at that subcommittee would have increased the price of houses in these areas, not by a little bit, but by tens of thousands of dollars to do what they were asking. Everybody on that committee except for one individual voted against that bill, including the Democrats. We talk about affordable housing. These are the things that impact affordable housing.
Gayle Johnson.
Oh, the next question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get this straight soon. All right, our next question will be asked by James Lang.
And this one's for
And we
Delegate
start with,
Miyares.
no, we start with Gayle Johnson.
No, Gayle just went.
I'm sorry. We
start
start with
with
Jason Miyares. Sorry.
What is the most important issue in your district, and what is your plan on this issue?
Flooding, sea level rise. I'm the author of the Hurricane and Flooding Protection Act. We are the most vulnerable areas in the country outside of New Orleans for both sea level rise and catastrophic flooding. And unfortunately, we are exactly where Louisiana was prior to Katrina. When Katrina hit Louisiana, their state assembly had to get organized not once but twice just to be able to work with the Army Corps of Engineers. Because at the heart of a lot of this, it's an engineering problem. And the federal agency that we have no choice, we have to work with, is the Army Corps of Engineers. But for us to be able to be in a position where Virginia, because too often when it comes to sea level rise and flooding, there's been this misnomer, which is it's either a federal problem or it's a local problem. My point is, how many localities are touched by the Elizabeth River? It has to be seen as a state problem, and it has to be state action to tackle it. So this would enable us to go direct with the Army Corps of Engineers, work with them, and also fund some of these items as well. But the Army Corps requires us to hire environmental engineers and a host of different administrative staff, and I think my legislation is a pretty good model, and the trap door is about to open, so I'll be quiet.
Alex Askew.
Yes, I know we are currently at a Lynnhaven River Now forum, but in my district, I believe it's education funding and teacher pay. I believe my district of Virginia Beach as a whole does not get our fair share of the education funding. I believe our educators are woefully underpaid. I don't believe our teachers should have to buy school supplies for our students. I believe our school system, our state should help fully fund those students so they can have an equal and equitable education.
Thank you. Nancy Guy.
Alex stole my thunder. Yes, this is Lynnhaven River Now, but public education is what propelled me into the race, and I do believe that it is the largest single issue facing our state and our city and the 83rd District today. We have starved our public schools for 10 years. The JLARC study that came out this year, which is based on 2017 data, as my opponent pointed out last time, ranked us 42nd in state funding to public education out of the 50 states. I find this unacceptable. I believe the standards of quality should be amended, that we should reduce our staffing ratios to reduce our ballooning class sizes, that we should pay our teachers better, and that we should restore all the positions that were removed when the SOQ was gutted after the recession of 2009.
Thank you. Chris Stolle.
Yeah, I believe the greatest long-term threat to Virginia Beach, to Hampton Roads, to our economy, to our health, to our welfare, to our children's future is flooding and adaptation to the flooding that we have. I have been an advocate for all the years that I've been up in the General Assembly, created the initial study done by VEMS that first charted the course that we're now on for addressing adaptation and coastal flooding, created the subcommittee, joint legislative subcommittee on coastal flooding and adaptation that generates so many of these solutions that are coming forward. I got funding for the 3x3x3 studies for the Army Corps engineers that are now looking at solutions for what we're doing, and it is necessary to do that in order to get the federal funding and then also the state matching funding. And I also carried the legislation that created the special assistant to the governor for coastal adaptation. So I have been a leader in this area since I got to the General Assembly, and I look forward to continuing to fight for that.
Gayle Johnson.
Flooding and sea level rise. And this is why I am running. This is the only motivating factor for me to be here and to stand up and ask for your vote. I was a lead accredited professional, a Class A contractor, and a certified green professional. And I know that there are cost-effective solutions that each of us can do today. And I know that there are ways that we can do tax incentives to help each of us. One of the reasons I am running is because last year when I heard people say, oh, we need state funding, oh, we need federal funding, it's such a huge problem. Yes, it is such a huge problem, but each of us can do so much individually, each of us, and it's not that difficult. So if you read the Dewberry report, they have the priorities, high, medium, high. Guess what's up at the high and medium high? Every single time. It's tax incentives for things that will help each of us take responsibility. We're talking about personal responsibility to help solve this problem. And that's what I bring.
Thank you. Our next question will be asked by Benjamin Hoyne, and we'll start with Alex Askew.
Thanks. Balloons are responsible for the needless suffering and death of our birds and marine animals. Currently, Virginia law allows for the intentional release of up to 49 balloons of any type within a 1-hour period. All of these balloons come down as litter, and most end up in our waterways. Question: would you support eliminating this provision, allowing intentional balloon releases and treating them with the same fines as other litter? Additionally, would you sponsor that legislation?
Alex.
Yes, I would look to support eliminating that provision. I know a lot of times we, celebrate with balloons. They're all birthday parties, gender reveals, a lot of other events we used to celebrate. But as the question stated, a lot of times our sea life and our turtles and our fish look at the balloons as food, and they choke and ultimately succumb to those injuries that they suffer. So I would absolutely look to, ban that provision.
Nancy Guy.
Balloons are a problem, and yes, I would support repealing this provision, which is unique in the entire United States, and treat them as the litter they are. But it's also a larger issue of marine debris, and we have a marine debris reduction plan in Virginia. It was promulgated in 2014. I read it today for the very first time. And there's a lot of marine debris that we need to address, not just balloons, also single-use plastic bags. Washington, D.C. has a program where to incentivize the use of recyclable bags, where you have to pay, instead of getting a discount, you have to actually pay 5 cents every time you use a single-use bag, and that fee goes to the city, and the city's actually raised $20 million doing it. Fairfax and Loudoun passed passed ordinances doing the same thing, and then they got Dillon ruled out of existence. And so Elizabeth Guzman, who represents part of Loudoun County, brought a bill to allow localities to have more stringent debris ban plastic bags. And again, it went to counties, cities, and towns and died there.
Chris Stolle.
So absolutely, we currently have legislation in place. I think the legislation that we currently have in place is too broad, and there certainly is an opportunity to take and narrow the definitions that are within that code. I would recommend, as people try to get legislation through the General Assembly, that you're often more successful doing this rather than trying to get it all at once, to try and get it a piece at a time. This is a broad and diverse state, and things that are critically important to us here along the coast fall fairly shallow when you start to reach out to folks in other parts of the Commonwealth. A stepwise approach, gradual improvement, I think, is the way to go.
Gayle Johnson.
Absolutely, I would support legislation for this. And this would be one of the things I would recommend, a tax on, like the 5-cent tax on plastic bags in DC. And other localities, other states have done a tax on single-use straws and other plastic. So if that tax is, say, at restaurants, they have to pay a tax, extra tax to have straws. They may think differently about whether they're going to buy it. And of course, that they would pass that cost on to you, and then as an informed consumer, you can say, no straws for me. But so that is one of the few things. Now, as far as is Virginia being diverse, we have rivers that come from the mountains all the way down here into the bay. They are bringing their junk all the way up there. So it is a state problem. It is not just our problem. Much of that comes from far, far away. I would be pleased to sponsor that legislation.
Jason Miyares.
I have 3 daughters, 12 and younger. I've been to a lot of birthday parties with a lot of balloons. I guess this would go back to someone comes to me with a problem. What is the problem? Does the bill solve the problem? And what's the law of unintended consequences? So to echo a little bit what Delegate Stolle said, I mean, if I'm seeing data, this is becoming a huge problem, then yeah, I could probably open to making some type of adjustment. But I also think we've also talked about a problem of overcriminalization in our country. And who are you going to prosecute on a littering charge for the balloon? I mean, that would be my one question. And I think Delegate Stolle touched on this a little bit. We don't vote on ideas, we vote on bills. So those are going to be the hard questions that get asked. There's oftentimes legislation that comes in front of us at the Assembly that is a good idea, but the law of unintended consequences, or it's just so poorly written and so broadly written that certain people are going to get impacted by it that nobody ever saw coming. But I think you have to be, if there's anything I like to try to at least view myself, is try to be thoughtful and deliberate in how I approach these issues, and I'm saying this stops.
Alex Askew. Oh, we started with you, I'm sorry. Our next question will be asked by Jim Deppie, and we'll start with Nancy Guy.
All of the cities and counties in Hampton Roads have publicly opposed seismic testing and drilling for oil and gas off our coast. Would you support legislation that would remove the section of the Virginia Code that supports oil and gas drilling off of our shores? And then question 2, would you support legislation to restrict seismic testing and oil and gas drilling infrastructure in our 3-mile Virginia offshore waters?
Yes. And yes. I oppose drilling off our shores. We should prohibit it in state waters. We should pass a resolution opposing it in federal waters, and we should do everything in our power to make it difficult for it to be done if the federal government ignores us. We should also repeal the part of the state code that still allows it, a bill which I believe my opponent voted for when he first got there in 2010.
Chris Stolle.
So I think that currently there's absolutely no need for drilling. I'm an advocate for really an all-the-above type approach to energy and energy independence. I think that we've made incredible advances, particularly in wind, but also in solar. But I also think that we have assets in the state that we should not retire, including our nuclear. I'm a former nuclear engineer, worked on nuclear plants in the Navy as a submariner. I think that we have energy sources that are available to us that don't require us to be taking and drilling off the shore of our coast. I do think it's important that we have access to natural gas, that we have redundancy in our energy approach, so that if there is some type of catastrophe that a particular asset of our energy supply is impacted or damaged, we have redundancy to be able to continue to supply homes and businesses with the electricity that they need.
Gayle Johnson.
Yes, I would support legislation to remove that section of the code. Offshore wind is now cheaper than natural gas. And by Dominion already putting 2 offshore wind turbines there and committing to putting 220 more, they are already there. That may be one way we can inhibit it. Need to backtrack, actually, because the state only has jurisdiction for 3 miles. The House of Representatives has passed a bill to ban offshore drilling, but the Senate has not, and neither has the General Assembly. In the meantime, let's support that offshore wind. As far as redundancy, I would just like to address that the natural gas pipeline that is being built is going to cost us $7.4 billion, and we will be paying that back over 20 years, we, the ratepayers. And Dominion already knows that there is no need for that, and 90% of that natural gas is being exported out of state.
Jason Miyares.
I mean, as far as offshore drilling, it's, if anything, it's just dollar and cents. I mean, 40% of this region's economy is based on our military. And the military absolutely does not want this, and we are absolutely going to be facing another round of BRAC closings soon. So when we're competing with both Florida and Texas for essentially the region's largest employer, and we have essentially a three-legged stool in our economy locally as far as the big three drivers are the military, tourism, and the port. The military is 40% of the GDP and opposes it. The tourism, I know the Virginia Beach Hotel Association has come out against it. I think obviously both the fear of both the risk, the environmental risk that comes with offshore oil drilling, but the visual impairment of what I think most people don't want to see, which would be rigs right off our coast. And I think obviously there's deep concerns with our port, which the port is 10% of the entire state's GDP, what the impact would be. So just from a dollars and cents standpoint, not just an environmental, but it does not help our region, and I oppose it.
Alex Askew.
No coastal community wants a tragedy like the BP oil spill that happened in the Gulf. So I would absolutely say I'd support both. As Delegate Miyares said, our military doesn't want it, and it affects our military readiness. Our tourism could not withstand a tragedy like BP, and the folks that come from across the country to stay in our beautiful hotels in our resort area don't want to see rigs off our coast.
Thank you. Our next question will be asked by Jim Lang, and we'll start with Chris Stolle.
As a Dillon Rule state, we are limited in what we can do at the local level without enabling authority from the state. How can we increase regional cooperation and have a stronger regional voice in the General Assembly in Richmond?
Great question. I think we've actually made huge progress in regional cooperation here. An example of that is what we've done in transportation. If you look at the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization and the HR TAC, if you look around the region and look at all the transportation projects that have been funded and are being built now, that's due to regional cooperation. All those projects were approved unanimously. All 17 of the localities that make up the HRPDC, which is also HRTPO, agreed unanimously to do that. That was a first. That's incredible. I'm very proud to serve on both the HRTPO and the HR TAC that helped make that happen. The HRPDC is really our center for doing the cooperation within the region, but also in addition to that, we created a few years ago Go Virginia, which is based entirely on incenting regionalism and having the different localities within the region work together. So in answer to the question, we've done some great strides moving forward, and I think we're going to continue along those lines.
Gayle Johnson.
Indeed, there is a lot of regional cooperation, which of course it needs to be with the flooding, because flooding doesn't recognize city boundaries and stop. So we are working really well across all 7 cities, and that's very important. Of course, going back to the Dillon Rule, I would like to get rid of it altogether because it's antiquated and it's not relevant for the 21st century.
Jason Miyares.
I think Virginia is generally considered, obviously, we were just ranked the #1 state in the country to do business, and also we've consistently been considered one of the best run states. As far as regional cooperation, I think Chris touched on it. I think one of the most innovative things we've done the last 2 years on a bipartisan basis was Go Virginia. Whereas before you'd have, for example, 7 localities with 7 economic development offices all trying to recruit employers here. And what was so innovative about Go Virginia is enabled, for example, Virginia Beach and Chesapeake, if they wanted to recruit a new employer, a tech company, say from Ohio, to come here, it doesn't matter whether they are located in Virginia Beach or Chesapeake, they can actually share the tax revenue. So it enables localities to team up better and make those pitches. I mean, we were hearing stories of out-of-state businesses that would say, well, we just met with the economic development crew from Norfolk, and now we're being pitched from Virginia Beach. Now we have the ability of the cities working together, and it's been, I think already, we've had some incredible results as that, and I think that's exactly the type of, I think, outside-the-box thinking that we need with our localities, with our regional cooperation.
Alex Askew.
I've seen many good bills down a party line vote in Richmond, but I've also seen our region work very well together, whether Democrat or Republican. I believe our next step is to continue to work together and get folks from across the state to realize how important our issues are to them, whether it is deepening our port, which we've accomplished, whether it's our infrastructure, whether it's expanding our rail to make sure folks in Appalachia or Northern Virginia are able to get things to their store, whether it's food or clothing. So I think we have done a good job regionally. Hopefully we'll continue to do that. And I believe we can do that in the General Assembly.
Nancy Guy.
I get along great with all the legislators from Norfolk and Portsmouth and Hampton and Newport News because they're Democrats. So the answer to your question is elect more Democrats. We do a pretty good job of regional cooperation on transportation issues and some economic development issues. We aren't doing as well on some other issues like education and the environment. And part of that is the partisan divide that just insists on seeing things from two different sides. But we have made progress, and I hope we'll continue to. I do want to echo what Gayle said. As the only former elected local official up here, I hate the Dillon rule. It is archaic, and it is bizarre that duly elected local officials who are full-time have to continuously run up and say, "Mother, may I," to a part-time legislature that's in session for 2 months a year. But sadly, it will take multiple constitutional amendments to get rid of it, Gayle. But count me in on the effort.
Okay, our next question will be asked by Benjamin Hoyne, and we'll start with Gayle Johnson.
Governor Northam recently announced the goal of getting to 100% renewable energy generation in Virginia by 2050. Do you support that goal? And please tell us 2 actions you support that will move our state in that direction.
I absolutely support that goal. The General Assembly needs to pass legislation, since this is an executive order that could be overturned, I guess, by another executive order. The General Assembly needs to pass legislation that makes it mandatory. And they need to pass legislation that makes mandatory the amount of renewable energy that needs to be met by certain times. Right now, we have some legislation that says, please, Dominion, would you consider using 15% renewables, please? That's not working. 2 things I would do. Electric vehicles. We need tax credits for electric vehicles. The countries that have done tax incentives for electric vehicles, that means maybe a tax credit, perhaps no sales tax, perhaps no property tax, HOV lane use. Those countries all of a sudden have all these, they become the land of the electric vehicle. We can do that. The other thing is solar panels. Those will both help lower carbon emissions. And tax credits for both of those scaled based to income, because the lower and middle class are the ones who need the tax credits most.
Jason Miyares.
I mean, I think I have a little bit of a different perspective. One, I'm excited about the future because I think technology naturally is going to solve a lot of the problems that we're debating here. I mean, if you think about it today, your Ford 150 pickup truck that's rolling off the lot today is as gas efficient as a 2001 Honda Accord was 18 years ago, right? You have 100 million more people living in America today, yet our carbon footprint is the same as it was 10 years ago. We had 100 million less people in this country. So you are seeing naturally technology that is solving a lot of these big issues that we're facing, and that's exciting. Now, the governor's put forth a goal. It's aspirational nature. I definitely don't think you can make it mandatory, because at the end of the day, I think it absolutely is going to hurt and put forth regulations once you make anything mandatory on those that are on fixed income. and it will serve, in my opinion, as a regressive tax. But, you know, when you think about it, you have as much computing power in this cell phone as the entire Apollo astronaut program. In the 1960s, the computing power right here I'm holding in my hand was 2 square city blocks. 2 square city blocks, and now you carry it in your pocket every day. And so you think about the potential here, and it makes me excited about the future.
Alex Askew.
I do support the governor's goal. I think first we need to look at the economy that's going to happen. We need to look at a training for those jobs, whether it's going to our high schools or looking at our colleges, universities, or even our community colleges, being sure we have folks that are trained to do those jobs that are going to use those clean burning, whether it's cars or whether it's wind turbines. And we discussed it earlier in the program, but I think we need to ramp up clean energy alternatives, whether it's wind turbines or looking to put solar panels on houses or things to improve our reduction in our CO2 use.
Nancy Guy.
Yes, I do support Governor Northam's aspirational goal. We've had an aspirational goal since 2007, and Dominion has failed to meet it. So I agree with Gayle that we have to either through legislation or regulation put some teeth behind those goals so that we meet them. The two things I would do, first one is join RGGI. And I note that the revenue that is generated from the sale under the cap and trade program can be used to mitigate the cost to low-income families. And there's so many things I do. Lift the net metering cap on solar so that we don't have a limit to how much solar energy can be produced in the state like we do right now.
Chris Stolle.
I have no problem with the governor's plan to go to 100% renewable by 2050 at all, the progression between now and 2030. I think it needs to be done with a conscious eye to the economy and the impact that it would have on jobs and the impact it would have on electric rates. So if we can do that, maintain our economy without any adverse impact, and we can do it without people's rates going up, and this being borne primarily by low-income people, I think it's a great aspirational goal.
Thank you. Before we ask our last panel question, I want to remind you of the cards. I have some great questions here, but if you need a card, hold up your hand. If you have a question on a card you'd like to submit, hold it up, and someone will pick it up from you. So our last panel question will be asked by Jim Deppie, and we'll start with Jason Miyares.
Improving and expanding transportation options in Hampton Roads is a long-standing problem. The General Assembly has given Hampton Roads permission to tax for road projects, but that does not include permission to use tax funds for other forms of transportation. Would you be willing to work to give the area the leeway to include the possibility of rail and other transportation options in future plans for these funds? And secondly, would you support adding resiliency to the SMART scale that determines how transportation funding is allocated?
I mean, I think we're seeing right now, if you travel between here and Richmond, you're seeing just an explosion of projects that have been on the board for an incredibly long time. And so you're seeing the widening of 64, you see both on the peninsula, you see the widening in New Kent. As far as, in my opinion right now, we have to dedicate those roads, that money right now, towards a third crossing. I think that is probably, in my opinion, the single most critical transportation infrastructure issue facing long-term Hampton Roads, because part of our problem is essentially geographically we're a cul-de-sac. So it's getting harder and harder, obviously, for people to come in and out. It is affecting our port. It is something the Port of Virginia is desperately asking for, is to find a way for us to get a third crossing. And so, in my opinion, until that is resolved, I don't think we should be diverting funds. As far as rail, I'd be curious to see where the voters are in Virginia Beach. We had a referendum on light rail in Virginia Beach. It was defeated by a wide margin, and so I'm not seeing the appetite for bringing light rail in Virginia Beach, or using state funds. I think we need to use it on our roads.
Alex Askew.
I believe the next generation is looking for a multimodal form of transportation. I believe that cars and carbon burning emission cars are beginning to be a thing of the past. I believe that the next generation is looking to commute to work maybe via train or light rail, and I do believe that's something we should look at in the future. As far as the new projects, I think we should absolutely look at resiliency, because we don't want to spend taxpayer money for projects that are going to be underwater in the next 10 to 15 years, whether that's looking to incorporate the rising sea levels with those projects and maybe taking some of those funds to help mitigate that flooding is something we should look at as well. So thank you.
Nancy Guy.
We're back to the Dillon rule, aren't we? I think localities should have the authority to spend funds as their citizens want them spent. And those change over time, because we had a light rail referendum that passed. And then John Atkinson decided he hated light rail and made a dead set at it and spread a lot of misinformation, and we had a light rail referendum that lost. So someday we might have another light rail referendum that passes. Smart Scale. My opponent created Smart Scale, and so I'm going to give him kudos, which is rare, because it's a good program that is both objective and transparent for rating transportation projects. But yes, we should be including resiliency in the scoring of those projects, because climate change is real, and as we create projects that are supposed to last 50 or 100 years, we need to reward those people who are willing to create projects that will meet those challenges.
Chris Stolle.
Thank you. Nancy's right. This is 2 questions, and we should get double the time for it.
Go for it.
A couple things. The first thing is if we want to have more money for transit rail, that needs to be a separate bill. House Bill 2313, which created Hampton Roads Transportation Fund, was very, very specific that it could only be used for roads, bridges, and tunnels. So if we want to do that as a region, everybody's talking down Dillon rule, but what Dillon rule does is it forces you to work as a region. If every locality did their own thing, that's the opposite of regionalism. So regionalism, HRTPO, the transportation, that was done because we were forced to work as a region under the Dillon law. Smart Scale already has a factor in it for resiliency. It's under the economic development factor in Smart Scale, and it's specifically for addressing any type of weather impact, specifically flooding. So it's already in there.
Gayle Johnson.
That's a funny place.
We're the only country that doesn't provide public transportation. On the north end where I live, it takes 2 hours to get on a bus to Norfolk. That's not acceptable. Millennials don't want to have a car for each person in the family. It is a basic service that we need to provide. Now, as for the tunnel being the most important thing, city planners have found for over a decade that the more lanes you add to an interstate, the more cars there are. And guess what? And then you have to add another lane. We need to have public transportation options here. It's absolutely essential. And the elephant in the room is these carbon emissions are causing sea level rise. The scientists used to say 3-foot sea level rise. Dewberry Report Engineering is based on a 3-foot sea level rise. Well, now the climate scientists are saying 6-foot sea level rise. And those engineering solutions that we have, that we are getting ready, that we're already starting, they're going to take 15 years. We have got to do drastic measures now. We're running out of time.
Thank you. So now we're going to go to questions from the audience, and I have several questions I'm going to combine into one, and because it's multiple questions, we'll give you a little extra time. And I think we will start with Alex Askew on this. So these all relate to gun violence and gun laws. As you know, Virginia Beach was the victim of gun violence and really brought home this problem to us. And I'll just kind of summarize the different questions I have. One relates to red flag laws that have been proposed at the federal level. Do you support those? We had a special session called by the governor to look at our gun laws statewide, and that session lasted 90 minutes and was closed. So was that appropriate? Where do you stand on control and ban on assault type weapons? And would you support a ban on weapons in public buildings? So that's a lot of different questions.
Yes,
red flag laws,
Yes.
ban on weapons in public buildings, the special session, why was it closed in 90 minutes without any review of gun laws, and a ban on assault-style weapons. Did I say that one?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
So I'll attempt to answer it. And I'll start with this one. I was highly disappointed after the tragedy we had in Virginia Beach that our legislators went to Richmond and only spent 90 minutes on the floor, didn't hear any bills about guns, didn't hear any legislation from the floor. I believe it was a travesty to the victims and a travesty to our community. I believe, and I know when I'm elected, I will fight for red flag laws, fight for comprehensive background checks, fight to close the Charleston loophole. It's just that we wake up every day and see a mass shooting, and that's something as Americans we shouldn't. And I will fight everything I can and everything that's in me to put it into mass shootings once elected.
Nancy Guy.
Let's start with the special session. I know what my opponent's going to say. Since he keeps getting to go after me, I'm going to say it for him. He's going to say that it was very appropriate that all the bills were referred to the Crime Commission and that he looks forward to coming back after they've been studied. Let's make it clear. All 8 of the bills that the governor proposed that were carried by various Democrats in the House were bills that had been proposed a half dozen times before, had been through the committee process, had been passed in other states, and have withstood constitutional muster. Now, there were some tweaks on them. Red flag laws. Yes, I support red flag laws. There's lots of different kinds of red flag laws. I support a broad red flag law, not just the limited red flag law that my opponent proposed during that special session that only dealt with a very small subset of people. Although I would support that, I would also support broader rights for people to have a path through the law enforcement system when they feel that someone they live with or are related to represents a risk to themselves and others. There is no one bill that you can pass that's going to prevent what happened on May 31st. And I'm going to keep talking because there were 4 questions.
It's okay.
May 31st, because gun violence isn't like that. It's just not. But we have a problem in this nation and in this state. We have 6 times as many people die in America from gun violence as die in Canada in a year. 30 times as many people die in America as die in Great Britain. There are certain measures that are shown to affect and reduce gun violence death. I'm endorsed by Giffords, I'm endorsed by Everytown, I'm a Moms Demand Action Gun Sense candidate. They can't endorse people. if you look at the studies, the states that have the best gun safety laws, who get an A from Giffords, 7 of the 8 of them have the lowest gun violence death rates. They are 30 to 80% lower than they are in Virginia. And I believe passing those kinds of statutes collectively, including all 3 of the ones that were asked about here, will reduce gun violence death in Virginia and save lives. So yes, I would support them all.
Chris Stolle. Chris Stolle.
If we go back to the Virginia Tech shooting, Governor Kane, after that, did not call a special session to take and have a bunch of politicians yell at each other across the aisle. He put together a commission to take a look at what we could do to address issues in the Commonwealth. Governor Northam asked that we review the results of that commission and see how the state did. And his review showed that based on the outcome of that commission, we ended up implementing almost all of the recommendations that came out of that commission. Sending the bills to the Crime Commission to have nonpartisan professional researchers review the legislation and make recommendations, just like was done after the Virginia Tech shooting, is absolutely the appropriate thing to do. And having that information when we come back to the General Assembly to discuss real recommendations, I think is also the thing to do. One of the bills, and Nancy mentioned it, that I introduced, under current law, there are people that should not have guns in this state. If you're under a TDO or an emergency custody order, you're not allowed to have, wait, can't be 15 seconds. She talked a lot longer.
You can keep going. This is a complicated issue.
Yeah, so if you're TDO or emergency custody order, you're not allowed to have a gun. If you have a protective order against you because of domestic violence, you're not allowed to have a gun. But nobody checks to make sure that you don't have a gun. So you come to my emergency room, we take care of you. After some time period, we release you back to your home. You may have guns sitting there, even though you're on a TDO or an ECO, keep having you there at the hospital. My legislation would make sure that those individuals could not have guns and had to prove to the court that they no longer had guns. I think that is a common sense approach, something that we can all agree on as a way to take and move forward against gun violence here in the Commonwealth. So this is a very difficult issue, whether we like it or not. The Supreme Court has ruled that gun possession is an individual right, and unless we change the Constitution of the United States, it's going to remain an individual's right to protect themselves. And we have to work within those confines when we look at legislation and move legislation forward. And so I think we have to do that in a intelligent, thoughtful way as we come up with solutions moving forward.
Gayle Johnson.
I want to reiterate what Nancy said, that those bills, many of those bills that were supposed to be considered in July had already been vetted and had been budgeted, which is an important part of the legislative process. You have to know how much something is going to cost. About the red flag laws. It's complicated. It needs to be broad. I believe that the best red flag laws allow the courts to separate a person from their gun for up to 180 days. If you're depressed, if you're suicidal and depressed, and your gun is only taken away for 14 days, is that enough time to get the treatment you need to make sure that you don't go back and use that gun? If you're angry at a family member or a loved one, and your gun is taken away from you for 14 days, is that enough time? Or are you just going to get more angry and come out angrier and more likely to do something? So I think the broader red flag laws are much more important. Now, banning weapons in public buildings. I don't think anybody, old person, should walk into a public building with a gun. I have read a very interesting case study. It's not a case study. It is being done in a school, a high school and middle school, where 4 individuals are vetted. They're highly vetted. They must take gun training. They must go do target practice every week. They have to be good, sharp shooters. They have to know that they might have to kill a student if a student comes in with a gun. It is an incredible responsibility, and I surely would not want that responsibility. Perhaps then, if someone knows that there are somewhere in the school, there are 4 people, sharpshooters, who have a gun, perhaps it might stop some of these mass shootings. Maybe not. I can't speak to that. But for just any person walking into a public building or a movie theater or a mall or a Walmart or any public space with a gun is just wrong.
Jason Miyares.
So I have kind of a unique perspective. I was a Virginia Beach prosecutor for a number of years, so I literally prosecuted those that had committed gun violence. And obviously the shooting on May 31st was the single most gut-wrenching thing to just go through as far as when you're dealing with families. Nobody trains you in this role to deal with just the unbelievable, horrific grief, and staying in touch with a lot of those family members is both just incredibly moving, but there'll always be an empty chair at every future event, every major milestone in their life, and it just rips you up. After the shooting, I made a commitment to myself. I was just going to look at the raw numbers. I was going to ignore the media. What do the numbers say about gun violence in America? And there's a couple things that utterly floored me. Number one, overall gun violence in America is on a close to 3-decade downward trend. And I was shocked at that. I bet you most of the people in the room here don't believe me. Go to the Center for Disease Control, look at the statistical trend lines. You can find them on the Washington Post. What happened? Mark Twain has a great quote. He says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but sure does rhyme." In the 70s and 80s, we adopted very, very, I would say, liberal sentencing reforms in our criminal justice system. Up until 1994, the average amount of time you spent, if you were convicted of an armed robbery, say you were convicted of 20 years for a rape or an armed robbery, the average amount of time you spent actually behind bars in Virginia was 1/4 of your sentence. 1/4. So when I was a prosecutor, I could tell you well over 80, close to 90% of all violent crime is done by repeat offenders. So we had an explosion of crime once we adopted these liberal sentencing policies, where we had this revolving doors of violent criminals back on our streets. We had an explosion of crime in the 80s, and what happened in the 90s was obviously a reaction. We adopted a parole abolition, truth in sentencing. What happened? Exactly what I just said. Overall gun violence started going down and has been going down for close to 3 decades. So that was the first thing that blew me away. The second thing that absolutely shocked me was that when you look at the Center for Disease Controls, the 10-year average, 62% of all gun deaths in America are suicides. 62%. That's another statistic that absolutely floored me. Then I looked at a study out of Minnesota that showed mass shootings, which are defined as shootings involving 4 or more people, which statistically is a small percentage of our overall gun violence, is overwhelmingly driven by mental health. All right, so when I looked at the fact that 62% of all gun violence is suicide, and then our mass shootings, which is obviously the horrific carnage we're seeing that's dominating our headlines, huge component of that is those that are deeply mentally disturbed. The situation in Parkland where the sheriff went to that killer's house 32 times prior to the shooting. 32 times. 32 times. And I decided at that point it would be smart to look at how do we make sure that those that are mentally disturbed and those that are dealing, possibly want to do harm to themselves, to keep them from obtaining firearms. So I looked at a lot of different states. Some people call them red flag. My bill is called the Severe Threat Order Protection. And what I think I think it's the most innovative proposal that you've seen nationwide, because I've looked at a lot of these pieces of legislation. One, it protects your due process rights, which you have a right under the Constitution not to have your life, liberty, or property taken away from you without due process of law. That is important. But the second is, and this is what I think is important, law enforcement investigates if somebody feels that you are a clear threat to yourself or others. They then refer you to a judge. A judge determines by clear and convincing evidence you are a threat to yourself or others. And then the most important thing is they refer you to your local community services board for a mental health evaluation, mental health expert. Because part of it is, if you ever had a loved one that's been dealing with depression, I've had loved ones that have, is they feel like they're in a tunnel with no way out. So part of my goal is to get those people help. When 62% of all gun deaths in America are suicides, you have to be able to address that, period. And so, yeah, I got attacked by the far, far right for saying, for my severe threat order bill. And I got attacked by those on the left, said it didn't go far enough, and I figured, you know what? That's probably where most Americans are, is right there in the middle. So I'm proud to have supported the bill, and my hope is to see it become law.
Thank you. Our next question is related to sick leave. So approximately 41% of private sector workers in Virginia, that's 1.2 million workers in Virginia, have no paid sick days or any paid time off. This creates a crisis for low-wage workers who must choose between taking a sick day for themselves or to take care of their children and losing pay or potentially losing their job. So do you support Virginia requiring employers to provide full-time workers with 5 paid sick days per year? And we'll start with Nancy Guy.
I don't know the number. We need to do something about paid sick leave and paid family leave in America, because we are the only developed nation that does not have a federal policy on same.
You may want to pull the mic a little
So
closer.
I guess this is a way where Virginia's going to have to do what the federal government hasn't done. And I will address and support mandatory sick and family leave. But at this point, it's an issue that's going to have to be studied, and it is an issue that's going to have to be defined in terms of what's full-time and what the economic impacts of it are across the board.
Chris Stolle.
Problem with so many of the things that we face now, particularly when you're up in the General Assembly, you have just hundreds and hundreds, and Jason touched on this a little bit. There are great ideas that make horrible legislation. And so, no, government should not be in your life every single day. Government should not be in the business place telling businesses what they have to do to attract employees or hire employees or keep employees. That is not the role of government. So, no, I wouldn't support mandating that employers have to offer. If you're a small business and you have 3 employees and you can't conduct your business if they're gone, I mean, that doesn't hurt big companies. That hurts the small business. It hurts the small guy who's out there trying to make a living day to day. And so that's not the role of government. Government shouldn't be in there telling businesses, shouldn't be telling people how to live their lives.
Gayle Johnson.
When talking to voters, this is a main issue, especially for young people, because now both members of a couple have to work. And so if somebody is sick, if a child is sick, if a parent is sick, they need leave. It is a primary concern. They want family leave. They want paid sick leave. It's very important. And like transportation, this is one of the few things that we do not provide for our citizens. Every other developed nation provides sick leave, and way more vacation than we get too. But the paid sick leave is so important, and family leave. When you have a child, You need to have time off. The father and the mother both need to have time to be with that child. A sick child needs a parent. It's very, very important to the fabric of our society. And if Virginia wants to have millennials settle here, we better do this.
Jason Miyares.
I mean, the states right now that are booming economically are the states right now which I think are important, which have bottom-up economies, which is 2/3 of all new jobs created in America are small businesses. And you meet your average entrepreneur, they are faced with so much stress right now, meeting their payroll, and every time you add more regulations on them, it adds additional stress. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want to make the jobs of the people, those entrepreneurs that create 2/3 of all new jobs, do we want to make their lives more difficult and more and harder for them to hire people? We want them to be competing, but I think what you would see is if you pass a host of new regulations in Virginia, what would happen is it would be a great boon for the North Carolina economy, because sometimes we forget that we are competing with 49 other states oftentimes for business. I mean, Thomas Jefferson called the states the laboratories of democracy. So you have to realize, and this is a classic case of what I say, what is a problem we're trying to solve? Does it solve the problem? But also, what's the law of unintended consequences? What does this do for those businesses that decide they're just going to go over the border to North Carolina and open up shop there, or for that small business owner who's worried how he's going to meet payroll, how he's going to meet his budget? I mean, you talk to most entrepreneurs that are small businesses that have 10 or less employees, they are very attached to their employees. They will work with them. They will find, if you're a good employee, they will do everything, move heaven and earth to keep them. And I'd rather be in that structure where it's not the heavy hand of government, but we both have employers competing with other employers to keep good employees, including offering them additional benefits. But I don't want to hurt and burden our small business and our entrepreneurs, because Chris touched on that. The big corporations, they can afford this. This is just one more thing for them to talk to their accountants. So they can afford all these regulations. The small business person who took out the small business loan out of BB&T, and they're living off a line of credit, and they're using that to hopefully meet their payroll for open up an ice cream shop or anything else, this is a totally different animal for them. And so I think that's exactly the kind of what I talk about, the law of unintended consequences sometimes.
Thank you. Alex Askew.
I think we need to first start by improving the overall conditions for our workers. A few folks on this panel have discussed, that it's, good for, good for the big companies and bad for the small companies. But I think every worker should be treated the same. I think sick pay, pay time off should almost be, a right as well as paternity and maternity leave for new parents. I think we also need to look at increasing, a livable wage, $7.25. I know I can't live off of $7.25. Folks have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. So I think we need to, start by improving the conditions of our workers in Virginia.
Thank you. Our next question is a much shorter answer. We had the opportunity in Virginia last year to be the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment and make it federal law. Would you support ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment? Oh, I'm sorry. And we start with Chris Stolle.
So absolutely, I sponsored, was a patron for the Equal Rights Amendment in the General Assembly, Senator Sturtevant's bill. What I did not support was the move that the Democrats tried to pull in the last week of the General Assembly session. One of the first things that we do when we go into General Assembly every 2 years is we agree to the rules by which we're going to operate. That agreement, the rules that we put in place, were unanimously agreed to. Every Republican, every Democrat agreed to follow the rules established by the House. In the last week and a half of the General Assembly session, a Democrat came up and said, look, my bill didn't make it through. It was the Equal Rights Amendment. I want to change how we do things here in the House. I want to vote to change the rules. This is similar to what Senator Harry Reid did in the Senate on appointments. up in Washington, they called it the nuclear option. So when you change the rules and you suddenly have no rules, then you don't function. That's bad government, right? So what they said is, we're going to do it just for this. We're only going to do this for the Equal Rights Amendment. Within 24 hours, 2 other legislators had put in rule changes for things that they wanted the rules changed for. So I did vote against a rules change that would have brought forward the Equal Rights Amendment. I fully support the Equal Rights Amendment. If it comes up again, I will fully support it again. I will not support changing the rules mid-cycle, or really not mid-cycle, but at the end of the game. That is bad government, and that's not how we should proceed as Virginians.
Gayle Johnson.
It appears that we need to change the rules somehow, because something as important as the ERA not getting out of committee is mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling to me that it's been 38 years. The whole thing is mind-boggling. Of course, women need equal rights. They need that protection. The reason apparently it was not passed was because it was killed in committee. There were so many things that were killed in committee. Let me give you another example that's very important to Virginia Beach. There was a bill that would have made it absolutely mandatory that any real estate contract would tell you whether that property was in a flood zone. We already have that for noise. That information should be there. And yet that was killed in committee. This is apparently a procedural issue that needs to be addressed. And another reason to vote for Democrats, so that we can get some things done.
Jason Miyares.
I think Chris noted on that. The one thing I never want Richmond to be is what is the utter dysfunction we see in Washington, D.C. I think we all can recognize that Washington, D.C. is utterly dysfunctional. I don't want to live I don't want to work in a legislature in which we decide we're just going to what Harry Reid did and just adopt the nuclear option and just completely change the rules of the game. I don't think that's functional. And listen, as far as the Equal Rights Amendment, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was just being interviewed 2 weeks ago. I mean, the deadline to ratify it was in 1982, and she noted that the deadline had passed. And so it's a little bit frustrating when I see a lot of commentator when arguably the most liberal justice on the Supreme Court has noted the deadline to ratify is passed. To do it, Congress is going to have to begin the process over again. It's not what you're seeing. And so, I mean, you can Google it very quickly and could find the interview. But I think that's kind of the posture where we are in the ERA. I mean, the deadline was 1982. I was 6 years old. So,
Alex Askew.
Yes, well, my answer is pretty short. It's a yes. I've worked with many of you in this room to pass it last year. A lot of passionate individuals come up to speak their mind and how important that equal rights is for women in our Constitution. I think it is, unfortunately, a prime definition of partisan politics, and I can agree with Delegate Miyares with that. I don't want Richmond to turn into D.C., but that was a situation where I saw that it mirrored our neighbor to the north.
Nancy Guy.
Yes, I would vote to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And yes, we need rules changes in Richmond. The Republicans hold a 2-seat majority, and they got that because a name was drawn out of a bowl. And, you know, my opponent likes to project himself in certain places, like here, as a moderate, but he casts one vote that matters more than any other, and that's the vote that puts Kirk Cox's fanny in the speaker's chair, because then he proceeds to stack all the committees and make sure that legislation he doesn't want to get voted on doesn't get voted on. And that needs to change, and that will change when 2 more Democrats show up in Richmond next January. I would have voted for the procedural bill because I think an exception for a constitutional amendment ratification would not have gutted the rules of the General Assembly and would have allowed it to move forward.
Our next question is about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that's been proposed by Dominion. This is a 600-mile pipeline across the state, and the end of it would be in the Hampton Roads area. I have several on different cards, several different cost estimates. 3.5 billion, 6 billion, I'm not sure what is accurate, but the cost would be passed on to Dominion ratepayers. So the question is, do you support the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and is this is it fair for ratepayers to carry the burden of that? And we would start with Gayle Johnson.
I absolutely do not support the pipeline. As I said before, Dominion and other authorities have already said we don't need that gas. In fact, we are going to need it at least until 2033. Meanwhile, you, me, and every other ratepayer here is going to be had that tacked on to their bill to pay for this pipeline. Well, then let's talk also about the ethics of it. Where does it go? Does it go through major cities? No, it goes through rural areas that affects small towns that are not well represented, and they are not being, the impact on their community is certainly not being represented. At the very least, those communities need to say, okay, we don't mind you being disrupted. Then we have the carbon emission issue. So if there's a hole in the pipeline, all that gas is being released into the area, into the air. There are many, many issues. Aside from the economic one, which just that alone should mean moratorium on the pipeline, stop it. They are now projecting it's going to be a $7 billion cost. Stop it now, put that money into the offshore wind turbine, the offshore wind farm. That is where we need to go.
Jason Miyares.
Well, the one entity that desperately wants it is our United States Navy. The last time we had a major polar storm, we literally were in a situation where we're going to have to cut off natural gas supply to our military. Now, you said to me earlier that 40% of our region's economy is tied to, our GDPs are tied to the military. We're about to go through another BRAC hearing. The United States Navy has essentially said this is part of our national security. Now, if you don't think that Texas and Florida and North Carolina and other states that are trying to get every scrap of our military assets and move them out of the region would not use that against us. And the second thing I would say is this has been the most studied pipeline probably in the history of pipelines, and it's been approved by the Obama administration and supported by the McAuliffe administration and studied by the McAuliffe administration and supported and studied by the Northam administration. So I think actually this is a issue that has broad bipartisan support, and I think when your region's largest employer is asking for this and begging for this, and it's been studied exhaustively, I think it's a no-brainer to go ahead and move forward with it.
Alex Askew.
So I believe ratepayers should not have to pay for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. When I think about the pipeline and where it's being built and how it's being built, I think about the minority communities that the pipeline's going through. I think we need to continue to focus on the cheapest, cleanest, and safest way to get energy to our region and across the Commonwealth.
Nancy Guy.
Delegate Miyares was talking about how technology's advanced and created solutions, and this is kind of what's happened here. We don't need the pipeline anymore. We simply don't need it. And the data that was used to show that we need it was flawed from the very beginning because you had the people who were building it providing the testimony that they were the end user that was going to buy it. Dominion has gone forward now with the wind farm. By the time the pipeline's online, it'll be pointless. So we're just wasting billions of dollars, putting our environmental, putting our environment at risk, and taking advantage of poor, rural, minority communities that don't have the voice to speak out. So I'm kind of on the opposite side of Delegate Miyares. I just don't understand, just because you keep doing, this is what happens when you don't have term limits. People get so vested in solutions that they can't see that those solutions aren't any good anymore. And Dominion has invested billions of dollars in this stupid pipeline based on old data and old technology, and they want us to let them finish it out so that the ratepayers of Virginia can pay for it, and I don't think we should do that.
Chris Stolle.
So as we look at other places in the world, if we look at Germany, Germany has significantly advocated for a green economy, and they've gone heavily to renewables. Their carbon footprint has gone up. The United States carbon footprint, we lead the world in reduction of carbon. We are number one in carbon reduction. Why did Germany's footprint go up, or their carbon emissions go up, when they switched to renewables, solar and wind? Because you have to have a backup. You can't always rely on solar and wind. And when they can't provide what you need, you have to have a way to provide that energy for your people. Germany didn't convert to gas. Germany continues to use coal-fired plants when its renewable sources can't supply the energy the country needs. This is an opportunity for us to ensure that we have redundancy in our supply of energy to this region, which is incredibly important for business and for the growth and for the future of this area. There is no reason why we would not, even if we didn't need it, even if we weren't going to use it, why would we not have the ability to have a backup to renewables? That's just common sense. If we talk about resiliency, if you lose one aspect of your ability to provide energy, isn't it a really good idea to have a backup plan for what you're going to do? Absolutely, I support the Atlantic Coast Pipeline.
We have, this is really a yes-no question. I think we can go through this really quickly. We'll start with Jason Miyares. Do you believe in human-caused climate change?
Yes.
Alex?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Chris?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, and then the last question before we go to closing statements is about Virginia being a right-to-work state. And what does that mean to you? Do you think as a right-to-work state we are able to provide the necessary protections for workers? And we will start with Alex Askew.
I believe in Virginia we should do away with right to work. I believe we should do what's best for our workers. Our workers should have the right to bargain. Workers should have the right to unionize and protect themselves.
Nancy Guy.
Right to work is the most misunderstood piece of legislation in the statute book. What right to work says is not that you can't have unions. What right to work says is that in businesses where there are unions, people cannot be compelled to join the union in order to work there. And there are lots of reasons people choose not to be part of a union. Maybe it's political, I don't know. But when I was on the school board, I know lots of people joined the VBA and lots of people didn't. I stand alone amongst Democrats in this region in saying that I would not directly assault or repeal right to work. What I would do is make sure that where federal law requires the union who is present to provide services to these people who are still not members, that a program be put in place called Fair Share that would require that those people pay some fee for that service so that you would eliminate what's called the free rider problem of people who get benefits from unions without actually paying dues to unions. But it is so embedded in the psyche of the Virginia business community that we are a right-to-work state and that that's a good thing, that I think we need to step back and realize that unions can still achieve what they want to achieve in this state without creating mandatory membership.
Chris Stolle.
I support our current right-to-work laws. Legislation was put forward this year in the General Assembly that basically said that if you work for a employer and there's a union there, you have to pay union dues whether you choose to or not. To me, that's un-American. That's fundamentally unfair. Nancy talked about a service, pay for the service. I don't pay for a service that I don't request. I mean, I don't pay for Cox Internet if I don't get Cox Internet. I didn't request that service. But it went further. It went further and said, not only do you have to pay, but the employer must take that money out of your paycheck and give it to the union. Why should the employer be forced to do that? To me, that's just fundamentally wrong. I think that if I choose to join a union, I choose to join a union. If I choose to not join a union, that's my right not to join that union. And if I choose not to join the union, I should not have to pay union dues, particularly if that union is supporting other activities that I don't agree with.
Gayle Johnson.
Right to work could actually be called right to work for less. It was started in the 1940s as a way to make sure that whites got the preferred jobs. It is not, you can work as an electrician, for instance. You can have a small electrical company. Nobody is saying that you have to join the union. But if you work for a big contracting firm that's doing big multi-million-dollar jobs, you have to join the union. That's if we didn't have the right to work. Yes, you would have to join the union. And the benefit of that is that they give you incredible benefits, incredible medical insurance, and the union negotiates for you to make sure that you're well paid. And I call right to work for less because what happens now, and this is in the construction industry, because I was a Class A contractor, I saw it happening, I know it happens today. This is what they do. They hire poor workers to do the job. They pay them less. They don't pay them benefits. It's undercutting the unions. It's undercutting our good-paying jobs by allowing these jobs to go out and be paid less.
Jason Miyares.
I just think the idea of forcing someone to join a union against their will is against the very idea of freedom of conscience, which I think is a cornerstone of who we are as a people. So I support our current right-to-work laws. Michigan just became a right-to-work state. Michigan did. So if you look at what states have been doing to try to be more competitive to attract businesses, Michigan has become a right-to-work state. If we got rid of our right-to-work law, it would be the greatest boom to a state's economy, and that state would be North Carolina, probably South Carolina. You would have so many manufacturing jobs that would look to relocate. And I think when you have a lot of northern states that are becoming right-to-work states, and then Virginia would be the first state to repeal right-to-work, I think, nationwide in decades. I think right after we just got ranked the #1 state in the business, I think it'd be the bad economic move long-term in Virginia. And that's exactly the type of move the General Assembly can do that would discourage business investment and jobs coming to Virginia.
Thank you. And thank you all for the great questions. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, but I do want to give the candidates a chance to do closing statements. And I had several questions about contributions, campaign contributions, and rather than ask those of individual candidates, I'm going to direct you to the VPAP website. It's the Virginia Public Access Project, If you have a question about who is contributing to any candidate's campaign, whether it's a local office, state, federal, they're all on there, they're all listed on there, and you can see exactly where their campaign funding is coming from. So we will, who's up? Alex, I think you're up. Or did you start the last question?
I'll do the last
You
one.
did. We'll start with Nancy then. So we'll do closing statements and I think a minute and a half, and we'll start with Nancy.
I wasn't an eco-warrior when I started this journey. There were other issues that I was focused on, public education, gun safety. But ramping up for this, because I'm a nerd, I read lots and lots of studies. Things like the NOAA report, at least the executive summary of the United Nations report on climate science, the Dewberry report. I met with lots of people who knew more than I did. People like Elaine Wohl at the Sierra Club, but also people like Admiral Phillips, the Coastal Resiliency Officer, and people like Jim Spoor, who heads up Reinvent Hampton Roads and is spearheading the efforts to bring wind energy here. And what I found made me really angry, because we have had this data for decades, and we haven't done anything with it. And that's the job of being a public servant. You are supposed to see the risks, and you're supposed to protect the people you represent from those risks. And the people in office now in the majority have failed us on climate. They have failed us. My opponent, when he ran 10 years ago, would not use the word sea level rise because he called it a left-wing scare tactic. He now says sea level rise is the most important issue in our district. But he also says, regardless of the cause, we don't have time for him to decide what the cause is. We have to act now, and it is one of the reasons that I got in this race. Thank you.
Stolle.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say it's an absolute honor and privilege to represent the 83rd House District. I would say that my opponent is absolutely wrong. Here is House Joint Resolution 50, which I was the patron of, which actually was the first one to lead the effort here after several governors tried and never got it off the ground. It says sea level rise 6 times, highlighted in yellow here. So it's not that we're trying to say terms or can't be used. I want to focus our efforts on what we can control and what impacts our lives. And what we can control, what we can adapt to, and what impacts our lives is coastal flooding. If we use terms that we can all agree to, then we can compromise and we can come to solutions. And we've come to some really pretty incredible solutions over the time. I got the money for the state, from the state, so that the city of Virginia Beach could buy Pleasure House Point and preserve Pleasure House Point forever for our kids. Again, I started the study that actually got us off the ground to start to address sea level rise and climate change. I carried the legislation that created the Joint Legislative Committee on Coastal Flooding and Adaptation, which has addressed sea level rise and climate change and flooding in all areas of the state. I carried the legislation that created Admiral Phillips' position, special advisor to the governor, and the governor didn't want to do it. I went in his office, sat down with him, and said, for Hampton Roads, this is essential to do. And eventually he agreed to do it. So to say that we haven't done anything is absolutely wrong. 10 years ago, we weren't doing anything. Now we are recognized as a national leader in coastal flooding and adaptation. A national leader.
Gayle Johnson.
We're also the largest population on the East Coast at risk from sea level rise and flooding. So we darn well better be doing something right now. But we aren't doing enough, not nearly enough. We used to think that we had till 2030 to do something. Now the climate data is saying we have 18 months. That was a few months ago. basically before the next president is sworn in. We have that little time. If we keep putting it off, we're going to go into a feedback loop. And at that point, our choices are going to be really limited. Every dollar we spend now is going to save $6. This is the National Institute of Building Scientists. Every dollar we spend now will save us $6 later in disaster repair. We have a limited resources, limited budget. It is up to us to now to use our resources wisely and to prevent these horrible, catastrophic results if we do nothing now. We are not doing enough. The Republicans have not done enough. They said, Dominion, please use a little bit of alternative energy. No, it's not enough. Finally, Dominion now is doing the offshore wind, and that will reduce our carbon emissions by 55% by 2030. These are the things we need to do. Our Dewberry report is for a 3-foot sea level rise. But the data is now saying 6-foot sea level rise by 2100. So we spent $2.7 billion for a 3-foot sea level rise. I asked the city engineers, so what do we do when it goes over 3-foot sea level rise? Well, that's the data we had when we were working with. That's true in 2015. This is only 4 years later, and that data is no longer valid. We have got to do something now.
Jason Miyares.
It is great to be here with you all. When I first ran, I wanted to focus on a couple of different issues. Number one, I grew up in Virginia Beach, going to the Virginia Beach Public Schools. The 3 daughters, the diamonds in my heart, they're all in Virginia Beach Public Schools, so I wanted to bring more money back to Virginia Beach Public Schools. I did exactly that. Gave our teachers a 5% teacher pay raise this last session as well. I wanted to keep you safe because I've been a prosecutor. I've literally had to be at crime scenes and prosecute criminals, and I feel like I've done that as well. I've wanted to focus on sea level rise and flooding and introduce legislation encouraging localities to join the community rating system, which has led overall in Virginia Beach to a reduction of flood insurance premiums by 10%. But the long-term goal that we have here, if we're really going to solve a lot of what we're doing on the sea level rise front, I think, is to be able to have Virginia be that partner with the Army Corps of Engineers to tackle these huge, huge problems, which I think we have the ability to do. I'm a very, by nature, optimistic person, not just because I think technology is going to be both an innovative way to solve most of these problems that we all seem to be wrestling with right now, but I think at the end of the day, it also means smart, effective, accountable government. And one of those ways, I think, is to pass the Virginia Coastal and Flooding Reduction Act. And I do have to give credit to Delegate Stolle. He has been one of the great leaders in the General Assembly on flooding. He has been for some time, and he has put forth a host of initiatives as well to help tackle this issue. But it's going to require everybody, left and right, to get together to make sure we're all heading in the right direction to solve this problem. And I see the stop. So thank you for having me tonight.
Alex Askew.
As I was knocking on doors last week in Kempsville, I met a young lady who talked to me about her small business in Norfolk. She mentioned that Matthew, just a few years ago, flooded her building up to 10 feet. We discussed how the increasing cost of flood insurance made her sell her business. And I think that's the biggest existential crisis to our region, flooding, inland flooding, coastal flooding. I think it's past time to do something about that. It's past time to invest in clean energy. It's past time to invest in improving our infrastructure to reduce flooding. And it's past time to let these same legislators remain in office that are do-nothings and don't want to, continue to protect our economy and our community. So I want to thank you, Lynnhaven. I want to thank Lynnhaven River Now for having this very important forum. And just as we approach the election, I just want everyone to remember, who is here to discuss these issues and who is not. I want you to remember who's there for the community, who was born and raised in the community, whose community is in their heart. So I thank you again for having us, and I look forward to the election coming up.
Thank you all. So next week, we will be back here next Wednesday night at the same time, and we have our Senate candidates. We also will have the delegate candidates from District 21, that's Shannon Kane and Kelly Fowler, and District 23, Glenn Davis and Karen Mallard, joining us next week. 84. And I also want to thank Rob McCausland for videotaping tonight. So he is volunteering his time to videotape this event. We'll put it up on YouTube and link it to our website and send that out to you all so you can share it with people who are not able to be here. Want to thank Ziders Theater for being a great host and hosting 3 of our candidates forums this year and being great to work with. And the biggest thank you is to these candidates. So I think it takes a lot. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of heart to put yourself out there, to run for office, and to be willing to serve us in Richmond. So thank you all for your willingness to do that. And thank you for your interest and for being here tonight. And don't forget to vote on the 5th and take all your friends and neighbors to the polls with you. So, thank you.
Good to see you.
See you. Take care. You too.
Thank you. It's very nice to meet you. Pleasure meeting you. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
I agree. Thank you. Thanks, Gayle.